Yes, Ian.
Oh,
I
I
think
did it
I did
again.
it again.
I guess I kind of forgot to ask like how specifically Ken was brought in. Is it just that these two groups were aware of his work and reached out to him, or was there like a period where people could apply to help us, like specifically with the Rouge National Park?
People do know of his work, right? And sometimes
Okay,
he has connections and people who basically put them into these positions.
okay,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah. So I know he's also been an advocate for Ontario Place, spearheading that and trying to save that, but also a lot of works with the Portlands. He's been doing a lot of work there. I think, I don't know if you were there in the beginning of the introduction when we were going to have Mark Ryan and also Shannon Baker from Waterfront Toronto, who's going to come
Mm,
on the 28th of February. It's going to be part of our class, kind of this climate action symposium, which I'm going to involve the class with. He's involved with people with Shannon and also Mark Ryan, kind of doing these key projects in Toronto and instigating that. So think about like, I think we talked earlier about West 8, like how West 8 and Detox did that kind of whole necklace, that spine along the waterfront in terms of public development. And then these key landscape architects like Claude Cormier or Janet Rosenberg came in and did those jewel parks to fit them in. So I think having people like Ken Greenberg or a pretty predominant landscape architect spearheading this is in good hands when you're looking at this public development.
okay. Thank you.
And the thing, like as I mentioned before, Downsview is really close to my heart too. Like I grew up in the near in that neighborhood. My family lives there as well. And when I was interning as a student and just kind of a fresh graduate in the early 2000s, I was working on the Downsview Park, actual Downsview Park competition, where James Corner, Peter Walker, people like Rem Koolhaus, and Bruce Mao were involved with the actual park competition and international park competition. That kind of fizzled through a little bit more because the vision was too big for the area. Then Bruce Mao came into play with PMA architects, landscape architects who were here in Toronto, and then fixed up the kind of that west side of Downsview and creating the park. But that took a lot of time and a lot of different kinds of initiatives. And now, like about 15 years later, there's this initiative now to work on the runway and bringing the vitality back into the community. It's going to be kind of interesting to see like how the runway now becomes essentially like the central park of this area, right? So this is going to be a big, like large linear park or public realm that people could use. And the big thing is, and the challenge is when you start in March, is about the idea of how to make things diverse, right? Like you're walking through this almost 2 kilometer long piece or stretch of runway. And how do you make each component of them different? Like united, but different, right? So that's going to be a challenge of that. So again, before we do the Downsview Park or the Downsview Runway competition, there's that kind of key assignment that you have now, which is the Urban Atlas or the Community Atlas project. And that this assignment is specifically more geared for you to understand like spatial typologies, demographics, land use, land development, and the community development of the specific site that you pick in that 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area. It's also good to develop a bit of your visual communication skills. So you're doing research, but at the same time, you're communicating that visually through diagrams, through sonometrics, and then, of course, then that interpretation piece that you're going to enhance or create that enhancement piece of the area that you think is more of an opportunity. There's a threat, but there's an opportunity to fix that, whether it be a streetscape piece or whether it be a parkette or a gateway into that community. That's going to be the piece that you recommend. Basically, what Ken did with the Rouge. These are his recommendations, and now you're going to be applying it through, a modest or maybe a bigger kind of design intervention in that community space. But when you're thinking about urban structure, there's two things that come into mind. There's a framework and the development pattern. Okay. So those are the kind of the two pieces. And so I kind of summarize this, and this is all from the chapter 2 of the Urban Design Handbook that I put together here, just so you can take a look at. So when you're thinking of scales of development, you're thinking about the idea of regional development, the village and towns and city as the next level, and then you're going down to districts, downtowns, and then neighborhoods, which is more now in the area of the Downsview Park competition, and also what you'll be looking at now to 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer is more of that scale of the neighborhood level. And then actually then drilling down into blocks, lots, and parcels, and then the actual individual buildings and park design. So these are kind of the folding down of the various scales of development. So when you're thinking about framework, think about framework as the line work, right? The contours. Think of them as this kind of skeletal structures of the urban area which can be constructed. So those could be natural, anything from topography, waterways, ridges, hedgerows, bosques, and any kind of crevices or other natural features that you could think of. They could also be man-made, and those are roads, bridges, highways, rail lines, and sewer systems. So think of those as more the infrastructure levels, right? So roads which were visible and the invisibles were the kind of the sewer systems below grade that happen. One thing that I call it, think of these as the armatures for development. So when you're thinking about doing a community development, you always see on the site that the infrastructure pieces are being done, all the roadways, kind of the line work underneath, like the utilities, those are all coming into play before the actual built development is happening. So, and then pattern developments, think of those as what we call the patches or the flesh, right? The actual pieces that go in between the framework, okay? So this is where the type and density happens, right? So when you're looking at the figure ground, those are the kind of the black pieces, the black developments, right? And the white is usually kind of the framework pieces. So these could be seen as more historical pattern development over time. So when you're thinking it for more of a large scale or regional scale, pattern developments could be then drilled down to the city. And then from that city scale, going down to more into the village and community design. And then even at a finer scale, you're looking at the block pattern itself. And then from that block pattern, you're starting then to look at more the individual buildings. So think of that piece as all the flesh that goes in between the armatures. So here's a quick kind of overview of the different levels of scale or the kind of scale levels. So from a regional standpoint, you could see on the left-hand side, the framework. Those are all the kind of major, larger arterial highway roads, artery routes that are being used. And then the development patterns, you can see the red pieces as where the city development is happening, and the green is kind of undeveloped at that point. So it's more of a kind of larger, broader view, I guess, expression of that, visual expression of it. And then as you start to drill down in terms of framework and development patterns, you begin to see from the village, towns, and cities, you'll see more like the individual kind of larger roadways, and then the kind of little more hamlet areas in the development patterns with the yellow pieces on the right. And then going even further down into scale. So this is always drilling down into a finer scale, into districts and downtowns. You can see now more of the interior roads, not just like the main arterial roads, but the interior roads as well, going into those neighborhoods. And then the actual kind of development. Now you begin to see even the land use or the land type. And then in the neighborhood, again, much, much more finer. You begin to see the actual block sizes. You begin to see the greenway of the boulevards. Now you even begin to see the patchwork in terms of land use. So you see yellow is typically used for residential. Red is typically used for mixed use or commercial. And sometimes what people do is they use various shades of dark shades of yellow to represent density, or a bit of both commercial and residential at the same time. So those colors that are used in planning, like the reds, the yellows, the blues, and the purples, those can even be done with different hues or different kind of color intensities of them to represent the amount of density that's happening onto that site or that specific area. And then, of course, then drilling down. This could even be something that you could be looking at into your other panels, like the actual block sizes and lots, right? And then the individual kind of building blocks. So the individual building blocks you see here at the lower end, this is somebody's, for example, individual house, right? So that's your the lot, the parcel that you buy of your land. Those are the buildings that are being developed on there. So the actual framework is the structure, the property lines around it, and then the development is the actual kind of building that happens onto the site. So you can see now the levels of scales between framework and development. Over time, um, the kind of the urban structure and framework development patterns have been evolved. And now frameworks has been used more to indicate specific categories of information. Okay, so they could be seen as individual layers of development. Okay. So one of the things, and this is one that I would recommend too, in terms of your project that you're working for assignment two, is looking at the mobility network. So these are ways of how to categorize the development or the structure of that 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area that you're looking at. So mobility network. So you could look at things, for example, how wide are the residential streets? Those are have a different kind of typology and look than, for example, a commercial street or a boulevard, right? So a residential street, which be much more narrow in size to accumulate or collect roadways that go into individual neighborhoods, right? So they're typically like 7 to 10 meters wide, whereas boulevards become a much more grander arterial roadway. And sometimes in boulevards, they have, a planted tree island in the middle, or they have a much more kind of grander sidewalks on the side or the promenades on the side of these roadways. So they basically are there to accommodate for higher traffic volume, right? So that's easy to done. But so one thing they could look at in terms of your project is you could do a section of both a residential street in your 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area, and then one that is the main kind of arterial road, a boulevard or commercial street in that same area, okay, on the outer edges. So you could see the differences between there. Then the next one is public space framework. So you're looking at ways to improve existing open spaces. So these could be anything from parks, squares, sidewalks and boulevards. Those are all considered part of the public realm. And how to integrate those into existing frameworks or existing kind of other networks. So for example, here in Downsview Park, right, you have that long kind of 2 kilometer stretch of runway that you're going to design. But then perhaps how do you connect that to the other existing roadways that are attached to it, like the east-west connections? So looking at opportunities to create those green buffers along the edges are very important. Then another thing that you could take a look at more individually is the block types. And this could be looked at both by use, density, and form. So each individual block, perhaps even taking, for example, the figure ground that you've done, but now you could maybe change it into a different color code. What's the actual block land use of that area? Okay, so is it going to be commercial in red, residential in yellow? Is it civic and more institutional, which would be a purple, blue color? Or is it green for public spaces like parks and recreation areas? So that's another way that you could do as a diagram. And then going down into the next level, which is the building typology or building types. So these, range from residential. So now looking at how the form of them are they townhouses? Are they condos? Are they duplexes, detached or semi-detached homes? Looking at more commercial and downtown or town center buildings, like for offices, or ones that are, for example, are 1-story commercial, and then above there, more mixed use for residential, kind of having that on-grade kind of commercial that we talked about as well. And civic buildings, again, that we talked about before, which are more government buildings, schools, churches, theaters, libraries, and community centers. So now you can begin to look at the actual style of the building and then its individual use. And so when you're looking at doing kind of the illustration plan, or even before we go into that, you could even start using these kind of drawings as a way to dissect that 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area. So for example, the mobility framework, you see it in plan, and you could have different color codes to represent either volume or use. And then on the side, as I talked about before, you could do a section elevation to actually see how wide the right of way is, and compare to each one versus like an interior kind of more residential street versus more of a boulevard. Public spaces, you could even do various color codings of the different kinds of parks. For example, if you're working along the waterfront, if you choose that as one of your areas, there's a different kind of relationship between the waterfront edge versus ones that are more the interior kind of public parks. And then you could look at the block type framework. So from a plan point of view, if you see here on the right, they have the color coding of the different kinds of land uses that they have. But then in the actual individual blocks, they have the individual buildings by the use. So you have the different color coding of those buildings. So that tower there with the blue represents more of an office kind of tower. So that's why it's in blue. And then the dark kind of orange, kind of a little bit of a hue of red that represents mixed use, commercial and residential. And then I think the third panel looks at kind of more the building types and the characters. This is where now you begin to look at the actual kind of quality of the facades, the heights of the buildings. Is it a mid-century modern home, Victorian home, brutalist kind of architecture? You're starting to now look at the kind of the style and the quality of the actual buildings itself. So giving that kind of homogeneous kind of look to that style. And in many cases, for example, if you're working in Guelph, there could be bungalows, post-war kind of one-story homes that you're looking at, and that's fine. And then on the edges of the street, or on the edges of the roadway, those are more kind of commercial buildings. So you're starting to now look at the quality and the characteristics of the buildings, and not just even of the buildings. You could even look at the quality and characteristics of the public spaces, like the parkettes that are existing. And when you're thinking about then urban design and community design inclusively, this would be kind of more the illustrative plan that urban designers, master planners do, is this idea of kind of creating that framework of these buildings and potential mass modeling for that area. And if you could see in the building structures, again, the land use or the kind of the use of the buildings are also incorporated by the colors. So, you see the reds as a commercial, the kind of the dark yellow and orange as a mixed use and residential, and the blue, purple could be community centers or kind of libraries or other kind of institutional buildings that are being used. So this is a kind of residential or community development that happens in terms of the master plan. So for your project itself, I'm not asking you to do the whole community design. I'm asking you to pick a piece of it. It could be something, as I said, as simple as a streetscape, opportunities to make it a more robust boulevard if that's necessary, or a gateway to the site. That would be that fourth panel that you're looking at. And these are all taken from, as it said, Chapter 2 from the Urban Design Associates Handbook. And also in Chapter 8 in Visualizing Urban Design, and from that handbook as well. It gives you some ideas of how to use like the color coding and the what I would say is the kind of the appropriate color representation for land use and building use. So that's basically the overview of that project, or the next project that you're working on. Are there any specific